Perfect. So today's class, the idea today is learning one concept that is critical when you work with JavaScript and many other languages. Asynchronous programming is something very, very common. And my experience is this topic is probably the thing that takes more time to people to understand when they have to start learning JavaScript, mostly because it breaks a little bit the flow of programming. It doesn't break it, it's just that it shows in a different way, and some people are not used to that. So let's go back again to one basic thing that we did the other day, so just to understand the very basics. So here I have this simple website. I'm going to show you this website. Okay, it's similar to what we have, and maybe we want to have something like I type something, hello, and when we type something and we press enter, we want to send it here as we did the other day. So to do this in code, we already have done this. It's quite simple. We just have to have here something like an input variable. So I'm going to go to the document, search for the input, and once I have the input, I'm going to attach a callback. When the user presses a key, I want to call a function like an on key press, for instance. Okay, and this function is going to be defined here. By default, we know that every function that is called by @eventListener, the first parameter is going to receive is an event. Okay, until here, and the other day we did this thing that if the event has a code of enter, we know that the user has pressed the enter key, and then here we want to do two things. One could be to show a message on the screen. So for that, we create a new element. And I don't know, because it's going to be a text, we set up the inside of this text to have the message that we wanted. And finally, we have to attach this element to the DOM. So let's go for an element on the DOM, but we want to attach this. In this case, is the ID log, I think I call it. And on log, we append a new child, which is the element. And finally, when we press the enter, we show the message that it's in input. Look that this input variable, it's a global variable, is this input variable we have here. So we're going to go to this input variable, take the content of this variable, which is the text, show it on the screen, and finally, we're going to remove this text, okay? So there's nothing written here. And just to make it a little more beautiful, I'm going to just scroll top this. So this is more or less the basic chat that we can build very easily. Everybody has this already. So let's test it. I go here, I reload this web, I say hello, press enter, and something went wrong. Sorry, I forgot I put the wrong name tag. I call LE, not P. So I go back to the code, reload, hello, and we have hello there. Okay, super simple stuff. We already have done this. But what happens when you want to put this code a little bit more beautiful, as we did the other day? So I'm going to create this my chat. Okay, this namespace, and this namespace, maybe we want to have an init function to construct this chat, and we also want to have all these functions that we have here. We want to make it more beautiful. We're going to put it here. So to do this, remember that we will define an object. The syntax is a little bit different. First, you put the property, two dots, and then you put the function that you want to assign to here. So let's put this one here, and also comma here, because between them there has to be always, and even between properties in an object in JavaScript has to be comma. And finally, we have this object. Okay, I'm going to move this a little bit more beautiful. Cool. So now maybe this part, this input, this is a global variable as we had before. It would be nice that this variable was inside here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to define that this object has an input variable. For now it's null. Okay, but when we init this, we want to assign this variable with some value. Okay, and do some actions. For now, if we reload this now, you will see that if you type nothing happens when you press enter, is because nobody has called this input function, so nobody has binded this event. So next step obviously should be to call this function, my chat.init. I can do it here, and maybe I can do it outside, whatever. So if I do this now, we're going to see both some errors. The first error is this onKeyPress is no longer a function, global function. It's part of this myChat. So I'm going to put here myChat onKeyPress. And the same applies to other functions being called, like this function here, show message, is no longer a global function. It's part of this object, this myChat. Inside this object, we have these properties. And second, also very important, is that this input variable is no longer a global variable. So if we want to access this, we're going to put myChat. Okay, so myChat here, myChat here, myChat here. I don't think I forgot to put anywhere else. Yes, here. Okay, so if I reload now, you can see that it works again as expected. Okay, cool. So my application more or less is the same. But you realize, and some people already asked, is why do you type myChat here and not this? This is true. I can type here this, and in JavaScript, if I put this refers to this object myChat, okay? Because this function, when somebody calls this function init, is going to call it through this myChat.init, so this will be myChat. So if I reload, save now, and I reload again, you will see that this works perfectly, okay? So I could have typed this instead of myChat, and it looks better, because if tomorrow I want to change myChat by another name like coolChat, I don't have to rename every word where myChat appears, okay? So that's a cool way, but, and that's the reason why I didn't want to do it prior, because there is a tiny problem, okay? Imagine that I'm going to go now to this onKeyPress, and instead of putting myChat here, I'm going to put this here, okay? Only this one. I don't care. I can do it on the other ones, but I'm only going to do it in this one, okay? If I reload the application and I type something and press enter, it's not working. And if I go to the DevTools, you will see that it says show message is not a function. Okay, well, it's not a function, but it was a function of myChat. But if we continue reading, it says it's not a function of HTML input element. And you say, what? So what's the problem here? If I put a breakpoint here, type something, press enter, and I put the mouse on top of this, you will see that this is input. It's not myChat. And this is a super common error that every single programmer, when they start doing JavaScript, are going to do. The reason why this happens is because you have the error of thinking that if this function is inside here, then this is this object. And that's not entirely true. This has a different rules, and this is something we are going to learn today, okay? But to do that, we have to learn a lot of things prior to this. So I'm going to use this skeleton as a way to understand what's going on, and we will go forward from there. So the presentation, Asynchronous JavaScript, which is the topic of today. Okay, so this is an important topic. It's complicated. Some prior knowledge that I expect from you. JavaScript, it's JavaScript is single-threaded. That means that you cannot block the execution and you cannot execute two things at the same time. This is not exactly true. You can execute two things at the same time, but under some specific conditions, and you don't share the same context, and it's very complicated. So for now, we assume that we only have one execution flow of JavaScript. Internally, the browser can have many other execution threads, okay? And obviously, when we fetch data, the browser is going to fetch a lot of data in parallel. We don't want to fetch one file, wait, and fetch another file and wait, because that will be very slow. So clients and also servers are used to concurrency, and doing HTTP request takes time, so we cannot resolve it instantly. So we need to use callbacks a lot, okay? That's what we already know. That's when we fetch data on the internet. And also I was showing you with the at-event listener also, because maybe it's also interesting that you can see it, but more or less some of the things apply the same, okay? Cool. So next thing, the JavaScript virtual machine that you see inside every computer, every browser, has some special rules that it's interesting that you check them. I don't want to explain them very deep now, because it would take me a lot of time, but I will recommend you, 1 second, I think I did something broken in the recording. Damn it, 1 second. Okay, well, I'm not sure if I'm recording the audio. Yeah, I'm recording. Sorry, I thought it wasn't recording the audio on the video. Sorry. So I would recommend you that you have some time. You check this video here. This is a very interesting presentation by somebody who explains all the inners of how to use how the JavaScript event loop works, and this will make you understand why if you stop the execution of JavaScript, nothing works, and also when some actions are going to be performed when you do some requests, for instance. As I said, super interesting. If you have time, check it because it's one of the best presentations I've seen about this topic. But for now, let's keep going. So as I said, callbacks, we're going to use a lot of callbacks when we work in JavaScript. This is one of the most typical thing that we use when we work in JavaScript. And it's important that you realize that if we use callbacks at the end, it's just a bunch of functions that we have everywhere in your code. And we have a lot of places where we are passing these functions to some objects or some functions to get those functions called. Okay. By the way, this button on click is exactly the same as doing button.addEventListener, passing to the click thingy the print info. Okay. So, oops. Going back here. There's a big difference between these two things. This is something I already said the other day. This first thing is going to execute the function, get the output of the function, and the result, the return value of this function, and it's going to be stored in A. If this function doesn't return anything when you execute it, it's going to be undefined, and it's going to store in defined, which is totally different from this other thing, which is I'm going to store in A the function itself. So be very careful when you use callbacks. You never pass the parentheses. If you do that, you're executing the function and passing the result. You have to pass the function itself, and the function itself is just the name of the function without any kind of parentheses. Okay, this is super common error. The other day on class, on Monday, I saw somebody doing this. So always be careful. This is super common error. Parentheses, you execute and get the output of the execution. Without the parentheses, you get the function itself. Okay, let's keep going. So why callbacks? Why we use callbacks and okay, I don't know, I put this example, but I don't think it's very interesting to put these examples. I'm going to pass. But the idea is that usually when you work with any kind of library or somebody else's code that is not yours, or you're using the API that comes with the browser, one common thing is that you have your code, and your code contains a lot of functions that you have programmed. And on the other side, we have that library or that API that you are using. And there's going to be many situations where you're going to call functions from this code. Okay, when you call function like array.push is to add elements to the array, or when you call I don't know, document.createElement, you're calling a function, and you know that that action is performed instantly by this function and outputs or returns something that you need, and you can keep going with your code. But it's very common that maybe you want that other code to call one of your functions sometimes to communicate with you. It's very easy for you to communicate with any library or API. You just call functions. But how do you do when you want that other library to communicate with yourself? That's quite common when, for instance, you want that if something happens here, it has to notify you that that happened. Okay, there's here a list of examples where you want to call these kind of functions. For instance, to allow third-party libraries or APIs to communicate with yourself, as I said, to receive data on a synchronous process, like you fetch something on the internet, it takes some time to receive it, to react to events dispatched by third-party libraries, like for instance, when something happens, like I connect to the socket, I want to be notified, this is an event. Or when you want to inject some special behavior inside a more complex process. Imagine that you have a library that does a lot of steps, but you want to inject a special action between two steps. Then you may pass a function in the middle so that it's going to be executed during the process, or maybe to execute a function later based on some rules. Okay, so using callbacks is super common, and we use it a lot in many programming languages, but especially on JavaScript. Okay, here more thorough explanation. As I said, they could be called synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous means that when you call something, it gets executed instantly. Asynchronous means that because this action needs to take some time because it's going to need to connect to somebody else. While we wait, we can continue executing the code, and that action will be performed or executed later. Okay. Just in case so you know, I want to make a tiny drawing here. Can you see my paint? I think yes, you can see it. No. Yes. No. Yes. In the chat. Yes, thank you very much. But I don't know, I wasn't sure that it was going to block the view. Okay, so what I wanted to explain is that in JavaScript, imagine that we have a block of code that is being executed. Okay, this is my code of JavaScript that's being executed. Could be, for instance, when the user clicks a button, you call a function, and this is the function it's going to call. Okay, if in this function we do, for instance, a fetch file, okay, fetch something on the internet, it's going to take some time to fetch that file, and when the file gets ready, it's not going to stop the execution of my JavaScript, stop it here and execute the callback. That won't be the good case, because maybe I have some variables that are not halfway written down. So what JavaScript will do is it will just put this function to be executed when this function finishes. Okay, so at the end in JavaScript, when you are executing your JavaScript code, your functions, they are never going to be interrupted until you finish the execution, and that the execution block gets free, and then the JavaScript virtual machine is going to take the next block of JavaScript and execute it if there isn't any block of JavaScript pending. Okay, so for instance, in JavaScript, if you do something like this, let me show you something as silly as I have a function here, for instance, and inside this function, I set set timeout. Remember that set timeout it's a function that is going to execute some code after some time, and here I pass another function. Let's imagine that we have a function do something, so we pass here do something, and on this set timeout you have to pass how long do you want to wait. Okay, so if I say wait 0, and also afterwards I do something like this. Okay, I'm going to copy this code and go to the DevTools so I can show it to you. So, okay, so imagine this code. I have this do something. I have this foo function that is going to call do something instantly because the time is 0, and then afterwards it's going to write hello. Okay, so if I call foo now, something interesting happens is that first it types hello and then it types something. Okay, when somebody could say, but the set timeout means wait 0. So if we wait 0, it should instantly do this action. But as I said, even if this was a long process with a very, very complex code here, it takes like 3 seconds, still it would be executed afterwards. And this is for what I said before, is that in JavaScript, any action that has to be performed later, okay, because you are calling some function that is going to be like fetch or like some WebSocket or anything, that is going to be executed later after you finish in this one. Because in JavaScript, you can never, ever execute 2 lines of code simultaneously on your single-threaded application. Okay, if you want to do that, you have to construct something called workers, and workers can execute code in parallel, but in a different context. You cannot share variables between the two. You have to use messages, which is more complicated. Okay, cool. So what I wanted to tell you mostly is that what is important is that in JavaScript there is a execution flow that you don't control, so you have to get used to it. That's why I was talking about this presentation, because they talk about this topic quite well here in this presentation. Cool. So as I said, what's a callback? A callback is just a function, and we can define it anywhere in the code, and when we pass it, it becomes a callback. Nothing fancy here. So for instance, this is a very common situation that people understand, and I want to show this problem because it's a very simple problem, but many people struggle with. Okay, so imagine that we have this code in JavaScript. If I execute this code now, which name do you think will show on the console? Can you tell me on the chat which one do you think it will be appearing on the console if I execute now this code as it is? Okay, people say Javi, my name. I'm going to make the chat bigger. 2 people say Javi, hi Javi. Okay, nobody thinks that it's going to say John. And the reason why you say this, obviously, is because nobody is calling this function. So obviously, this variable is not being changed because nobody is changing this function. Cool, this is the simple part. Let's make it a little bit more complicated. Imagine that I do this, okay? If I do this, I define the name Javi, I have function and console name, and then I call this function. Again, if you are a little bit used to programming, you will see obviously that this is going to output Javi again. Why? Because this function is going to execute this line, is going to define this function. No, it's not going to execute it yet, It's going to execute this function, which is going to print the current state of name, which is Javi, and then it's going to call my function, which is going to change the name, but the name already has been printed, so it still will be Javi. Super simple stuff. But make it more complicated. What happens if we swap these ones? Okay, if we swap these ones, we still understand now that name is Javi, then define a function, don't execute it. Then we call this function, now name is John, and when we show the name, it's going to show John. Okay, so until here, I can understand that any person familiar with programming can understand these basic rules. But you will find a lot of cases like are similar to this one I'm showing you, where you were totally sure that it should be printing Javi instead of John. I'm going to show you how. So imagine I have this one here now. Okay, now we have a callback in the middle, which is still a function. As you can see, this is a function. It hasn't changed a lot. But now you can see that we have name equals Javi, then wait some time, in this case 1 millisecond, could be 0 milliseconds also, and then change it to John, and then you console log the name. And because you are going to see this code like this, it's more likely because this function is tiny and that you're going to assume that name is going to be executed right away. Many people will say, no. As Javi said before, this is going to be executed after the flow is finished. So that means that this function is going to see later. So in this case, it will print Javi. Okay, we are still in the same case. But it's many situations where you're going to start passing callbacks to different places. And in your mind, you're going to think that that function is going to be executed during the execution flow. Like you're going to read from up to down your code. And because you're reading it from up to down, you're going to assume that this action is being performed. But this action is not going to be performed until some event happens, some action is performed that is related to this event. Okay, so that's usually the problem that many people have. You don't know how to read the execution flow of the application. You're very likely to read it wrong. Okay, so let's going to go a little bit deeper. Okay, so imagine that we have this now. We have an object that has name Javi, and we have a function that says this name. Okay, because I have this function that says this name, and this is supposed to be this object, and name is Javi. If we call this function, we say obj.say and parentheses, and we put the name, we call this function, we should expect that it's going to show on the console Javi. Okay, but if we do this, check that we have changed just, instead of calling obj.say directly, we store it in a function and we call it. If we do this, it won't print anything because, well, we can do the test if you want to. Maybe I should have shown you this test prior, but let's do it on the console. That could be a better fit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type this code here. Okay, I'm going to, first let's do it the simple way, which is this one. If I do this, it says Javi. Obviously, because it's calling from this object here, the method say, and the method say is going to read from this object is going to read the name, okay? And the name is Javi. But now let's store this function, this obj.say. Let's start it in a different variable, okay? It's still the same function I called before, but instead of calling it directly, I'm going to store it in a temporal variable, this func, okay? And I'm going to call func now. And what you will see is that it doesn't print name. And you may say, why it doesn't print name? It prints something, but it doesn't print name. So there's something going on here that I haven't explained yet, is how the word this works. If you don't understand how the word this works, you are very likely to have problems. So between the execution flow and this reservoir word is one of the most common problems when you start playing with JavaScript, that you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Okay, so how does this works? Because I can show you something interesting. Is that if I show you the code of this function here, I can put a breakpoint here. So if I go to the console again and I call function, so I execute it, you will expect that if I put the mouse on top of this, it's going to show me this object. But if I do it now, check, it says window. It doesn't say my object, it says window, which is strange. Why does it say window if I was expecting the other? But, and here comes the strangest thing, if I call this function directly, obj.say, and I put the breakpoint here again and execute it now, I put the mouse on this, and now it says object, name Javi and function say. So there's something going on here. The this parameter is not behaving as we expect. Okay, the this parameter has some special rules that apply to what's the value of this when we execute in a function. And because this case for you may seem very weird, you may see this and say, well, okay, Javi, but I'm not going never to take an object and a function and store it in some variable and call it later. I mean, I will always call this function directly, which is the usual common situation. Then this will never happen to me, but it will happen to you, because this is exactly what happens when you pass a callback to a function. When you pass this obj.say to any function as a parameter, as a callback, it's going to remove this kind of dependency between obj and say, and when you call it, it's not going to be executed on the object, it's going to be executed on window, which is the global object of JavaScript. So that's the problem, okay? So this is what I call the this problem. And many people don't understand the this, and they make this error because you expect the this to behave in a different way. So just so you understand, I'm going to show you a little bit more the code, but so you understand what was going on here when I was doing all this example. Okay, so when I was doing here, the rule goes like this: when you execute a function, okay, like in this case, okay, it says Javi. If this function called the word this is going to refer to the object through which the function was called. In this case, we're calling this function through this object. Okay, so then the this on this function is going to be this object. But if we start this function in a separated from the object, I'm reading the function pointer, the code of the function, and I'm stored here in this variable, because when I call this function, I'm not calling the function through any object, then the this is not the same. And this is exactly the same as when you do something like, I don't know, button at event listener, and you type click, and here you pass your obj, for instance, say. If you do this, the problem is that internally, when the event calls this function that you are passing, this object information is lost. And because it's lost, if your function reads the this, you are not going to have what you expect, and that would be a strange error and something that's usually hard to debug. So that's why I'm putting so much effort on this concept. So let's go back to the slides where I can explain a little bit better the situation. Okay, so here, for instance, this is the most common error that you will face when you work in JavaScript. You are going to go to this code here, you're going to a query selector, you're going to attach an event, and for this event, you may want to put like a anonymous function like this one. So you're going to call this on button preset. Maybe you want to take this on button preset and pass it directly here. Both things will be the same. In those, if you do both things, you will see that when you, well, first, if you do it this way, when this anonymous function gets called, when the button is pressed, it's going to call this anonymous function, this value is not going to be the my class element. It's going to be by default, when you call when the system calls a function from an event listener, this by default is the element itself. So this now will be button. Okay, so every time you put this inside an anonymous function that you pass to event listener, this is the object where you attach this event. Because we attached the event to button, this is button now. Okay, and you can see this in my example I was showing you before. If I go here to the DevTools and I show you, like, I'm going to reload the website, sorry, and I'm going to show you that when I have this event listener here, and I want to call my chat on key press here, if I go to on key press and I put a breakpoint here, and if I reload the code and type something, oh sorry, well, I press the key, so it goes here to this place, I will expect that this function will be my chat. But if I go here to the this and put the mouse on top, you see it's the input. Okay, why? Because I attached the event to input, and because I attached the event to input, when this function is called, the this refers to the element, in this case the input. Okay, so first super common error, expect this to be this this code. Okay, what I was expecting is that because this let me show you a little bit better here. This function is in my chat. I was expecting that when it calls here, the this will be my chat, and no, the this is the input element because it's where the element was, the event was attached. Okay, so as I said, ultra super common error everybody does. Okay, so let's see how we can fix this. As I said, the main problem is that we do not control the this. The this is automatically solved by the virtual machine based on some internal parameters. If we call the function through manually ourselves, through an object, it's the object. If that function is called without any object, then it's going to be window. And if the function is called by an event listener from an HTML element, it's going to be the HTML element. Okay? So error here, how we can solve this error. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is another common error here that you want. I have this class person, and the person says say hi, and I have person is Javi and person is Pepe. And when the button clicks, I want to say Javi, say hi. And if we execute this, you will see that it doesn't say Javi or Pepe because the this, instead of being this class, is going to be window. Sorry, it's going to be button. And because button doesn't have any parameter called name, it's not going to show anything. Okay, I can show you this also. Let me show you so maybe you can understand it a little bit better here. So imagine this situation. I want that when I call this function, no, sorry, I want because I'm going to give you this example later. Okay. Okay, and also here, pay attention that Javi and Pepe both are the same class. So both, when I say hi, they are going to execute this function over here. And we tend to think that saying Javi.sayHi is different. The Javi.sayHi, not with executing it, just this variable is exactly the same as this other variable, but it's not. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. So sorry, we expect that they are exactly the same but behaving, but we can pass it. But the important thing to understand here is that these both functions are exactly the same. So it doesn't matter if I pass Javi.sayHi or if I pass Pepe.sayHi. In both situations, it's going to be exactly the same. So this is something that we have to be aware. So I'm saying this in case that because let me replicate this code so you maybe understand better. I'm going to go to the slides. Sorry, I can't find the slides. Is here. No, it is not slides. Here. Sorry, here. Okay. So in this code I have here, for instance, no, I was searching this code. Sorry, the previous slide. Yeah, this one. Sorry. So imagine I have this code. I'm going to go to the DevTools. I'm going to type this code here. So I have Javi and Pepe. Okay. So for me, it's not the same to pass Javi.sayHi than to pass to a function. Imagine I have a function called func that is expecting some callback. And sorry if you cannot see it well. I'm going to put it a little bit high. Okay. So I will expect that this is not the same as this, for instance. Okay. That this function calling with this parameter should be different than this function calling with this other parameter. But the truth is that these both parameters are exactly the same, okay? Because they are just the function itself. Okay, it's this function, and this function is the same for every instance of this class. So that is why when you pass to some callback one function, be careful because you are not attaching this function to this object. You're just passing the function itself, not the function attached to the object, which is what we usually want to do. Okay, cool. So let's keep going. Hoisting, another topic, interesting topic. Okay, 1 second, I need to close the door because there's a little bit noise. Okay, so this is another interesting thing that we may want to know when we work with JavaScript, and it's related to the topic we are talking, which is called when I have a variable, it's obvious that if I have a function with a variable inside, so let's go to our code editor here, and it's obvious that if I define this element function here, I can access this function here. But if, for instance, if I define a variable here, like foo equals 1, I cannot access this variable from here because this variable is local to this scope Okay, this variable only exists in this scope. But if I put this variable here, this variable can be accessed always because this is a global variable. Cool. But what happens, and this is more a complex situation, imagine this strange case. I'm going to go with a very strange case. Imagine I have a function here, okay, and this function, just to keep it working as it was working before, I'm going to call the on key press and pass the event. Oops. Okay, so this is more or less what I had before. Okay, when the key is pressed, it's going to call this function. This is an anonymous function. I define it here, this function, and this function is going to call the key press and passing the same event here. So exactly the same as we had before. But what I wanted you to think about is, imagine I have this variable foo equals 1. The question here is, can I read this variable foo from inside this function? If you think about how programming languages work, this variable only exists on the scope of this function. So, and it's obvious, like here, for instance, I'm going to put here this code here, for instance, which, by the way, it's an example I'm going to show you later. But anyway, so in JavaScript or in other languages, you will expect that this variable only exists on this function. So when I execute this function, it's going to create this variable, it's going to attach some events. In here, for instance, I'm modifying it, but at the end of this function, this variable should no longer exist. So here, when I read this variable, this is a kind of a strange case because this variable is not from this function, but it's also not global. So can I access a variable that is from another function, even if that is a local variable of another function? So the fast answer is yes, and JavaScript allows to do that, but we have some rules that we have to know first. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation so you understand. So imagine this case here. We have a query selector all. Remember that query selector all returns an array with all the elements that matches this selector. So I have here a lot of buttons. I'm going to iterate through every button, like from 1 that starts in 0 and to the end of the length of all the buttons. And for every button, I'm going to take this button here and I'm going to say, hey, if the user clicks the button, okay, I want to show on the console the user clicked the button A, okay, on the screen. So this seems first simple if we do this code, and let me show you. Let me show you here this code so you can understand it better. Okay, check that this variable is using hoisting now because this variable is defined here in the function outside. It's not defined in this function. Is defined in another function, in this case in the upper function. So let's imagine that this is inside some special code. Okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to copy this code and I'm going to put it maybe, I don't know, in my init function so you can see it. So as I said, it's going to search for several buttons, because my HTML doesn't have several buttons. I'm going to do something very silly and add several buttons here. So let's have like a here. Let's have a button, okay, that says click me. Okay, I don't know if I can do this. Okay, so I have 6 buttons. Okay, so if I go back to the DevTools, I reload. Okay, well here, sorry, I forgot something. Yes, forgot to type something. 1 second. On the code, I copy it wrong. Yes, this is a common error. These quotes are not the same quotes as these ones, because this is the quotes that have a little bit of slope. That the slides always put this quotes and they are wrong. So I'm going to change them in case somebody makes the same mistake as I did. Okay. This happens sometimes when you type quotes in the slides, it makes the beautiful quotes, but the beautiful quotes are not the ones accepted by the programming languages. So be careful when you copy code from here, because sometimes this happens. Okay, so going back to my code, I have this now that when my chat is initialized, is going to fetch for all the buttons, go on this for loop, and when you click one of the buttons, it's going to tell me which number of the button was on the DOM. So if it was the 0, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, 6. Okay, so let's go back to here. Let's do a reload. Sorry. Okay. First of all, maybe we want to see if we got all the buttons here. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I'm going to reload. So when the execution init started, so this when the init function goes to here, let's see how many buttons we have here. If I put the mouse on top, you will see there's a lot of buttons here. And it's true, if I go to the website now, which is here, and I put the DevTools, you can see these are the buttons. Okay, cool. So let's remove this, press play. Here comes the strange situation. Remember this code. The idea of this code is that when I click a button, I want to see the value of the button. So the first button should be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? But if I go to the code and I put the DevTools next to it and I click the buttons, sorry, I have to make this smaller, otherwise you won't be able to see it. I'm going to put it like this. Yep. Okay. Check what happens on the console now. I press the first one and it says 6. Press the second one, 6. Press the next one, 6 again. Every single button says 6. So this goes against our intuition. Something is going on and it's related to how the hoisting works. So let's go back to our code to see what's going on. And it may be very easy to understand if I do something like this. The value of E is, okay, so check this code now. Okay, we have a lot of buttons. For every one of the buttons we iterated, we placed the uneven listener, and when the button is clicked, we call this. And this function is not being called now. It will be executed when we click on the button. After doing this for loop, we are going to show the value of y. So if I do this now, which value do you think will show on the console? Which value of I is going to show on the console? If I execute this code now, what do you expect? You can write it on the chat. And we can see it very easily. I can save it meanwhile. So if I go here and I'm going to, okay, people say 6. So I reload and the value is 6. Okay, makes sense if you think about it. Because if I started here, E goes from 0 to button's length. At the end of this for loop, I has to be 6 because it has to go through all of them, and then it's going to print 6. And here comes the error that many people think. You were expecting that this E value, this I, sorry, was supposed to store here the value it had when the function was defined. But that's not true. What is happening here is that this function is accessing this variable I, and this variable I will have changed to 6 when it's called. Okay, so now if I call this function through here, when I click it, the value of I, and I can put a breakpoint here, do you see? So if I click it here, the value I is 6, because that was the last value it had prior to this function being called. Okay, so this is one of the also very common errors, that you will expect that if you hoist a variable, it's going to freeze the value of this variable in that specific moment. But that's not true. Hoisting doesn't freeze the value. Hoisting is going to just give you access to the variable from inside this function. So that means that if this variable changes, it's also going to change. Okay, I know that it may look like I'm going through different topics that are not related, but all of them are super related to what we're trying to achieve. Okay, which is what happens when I have callbacks, because the problem we have here is that we are going to pass a lot of callbacks, and we pass callbacks, we're going to assume some, like, that this is going to be something, or the hoisted variables are going to be something, some value, and that won't be true. And because it won't be true, it's very likely that when you do these kind of things, you're going to end up with strange errors that you don't know how to solve. Okay, so that's why I want to always emphasize that it's very easy to make the mistake. It's very easy that you expect something, and at the end, what you get is not exactly what you were expecting. Okay, also in this case, because you are using hoisting, it's very easy to misunderstood and the y value to think that is here, because hoisting, we are using a lambda function, an anonymous function. This anonymous function, because it's inside this for loop, it makes you feel like the console log is being called during the execution of the for. But you have to pay attention, because this is exactly the same. This more or less is very similar to having this function outside, like here. Imagine I take the function I was defining here and I move it down and I just put the name of the function. And if I put it like this, you start feeling that it's a different thing, okay? Just taking this function, putting it outside, which is exactly the same in terms of JavaScript, okay? Because this code, this console log is now outside of the for loop, you feel that now it makes more sense. This I value should be 6 and not the number it has when the for loop was executed, okay? So this is one of the things that people have problems. When you use anonymous functions, you tend to assume wrong things, okay? So how can we solve this problem? Imagine that we want to have here a way to know which button it is when it's pressed. We want to like freeze somehow the value. There's a very simple trick that you can use, and this is one of the first tricks I'm going to explain today about how to solve these problems. So the first trick is you can, if you want to, you can store inside the button any data. You don't have to type data underscore whatever, but it's a good practice to do it, because otherwise it may crash with some other variable inside this class, okay? So for instance, I say data underscore I equals to I. So now I freeze the value. So I'm copying the current value here. I'm copying it here. If this was an object, we are not saving much, but if it was a number or a string, it's going to make a copy. Remember that in JavaScript, if it's a number, a boolean, or a string, it's going to make a copy, but if it's an object, an array, or any kind of object, then it's going to be a reference. For now, because we assume this is a number, okay, it goes from 0 to 6, then it's going to store here the number. So in the first iteration, it's going to store in data I is going to store 0. On the second iteration, it's going to store 1, and the next iteration 2, and every single iteration of this is going to store different numbers. So at the end, we have every button will have a different property. Cool. Can we read that property from inside this function? Yes. Remember that I said before that you add event listener to any object on JavaScript. When this function is executed, the this refers to this element where you attach that event listener. So if I do this now, like this dot data I can read what I stored on this object, okay? I can show you this example now very easily, so you see that I'm not lying. Instead of doing this, I'm going to put this dot data I, for instance, and I'm going to do the trick I did before, which is saying that the button is going to be I, okay? Just by doing this super slight change, if I go back here and open the DevTools and I click the button, sorry again, you can see that this is now the button 0. If I click on button 1, button 2, button 3, 4, and 5, okay? So this is super easy. So let me read the question. Will that work if we are not saving it to the DOM but to a local variable in the new scope? How to say it? The problem is that the add event listener only works with DOM elements. So in this case, you cannot do add event listener to any class or object that you have created. Add event listener is a method from the HTML element. So yeah, you can store data I in any object that you want to, but in this case, what we are abusing, the hack we are using here is that we use, when we know that when this function is going to be called, the this is going to be the object where the event listener was attached. So this only works with HTML elements, but you can add any property to any object in JavaScript anytime. So it depends on what you want to do, okay? We're going to see more tricks now, so you are going to have more ideas of how you can solve these kind of problems. Okay, so 1 second. I don't know why I have these annoying more tools here on the screen. Right? I have these more tools here. Damn it. Oh yeah, now it's gone. Cool. Okay, so let's keep going. As I said, this is a common error, and this is a common solution. I use this solution many times when I work programming in JavaScript. So you can use this if you want to, from the DOM element, to retrieve something, okay? But it makes some sense only for DOM elements. Let's going to go for other solutions. Okay, like this one. This is not for the DOM. Imagine I have something like this. This is my chat, and when I receive some message on a socket, let's assume this socket variable is, I don't know, maybe inside, maybe this would be better to have it here. And I want to call this function show, okay, this function here that shows something, okay? But we have the same problem as before. which is that this callback, this function that we have here, is going to be assigned to this socket. So when the socket calls this function, because the function is inside the socket, when the socket calls the function, the this is going to be socket, not my chat, not that this is going to be socket. That's why I put the same color here. This, and this socket is the same. So because socket doesn't have a method show, it's going to crash. Okay, we want that this here is exactly the same this as outside. So when you define a function, it's very likely that you're going to assume that the this inside this function is the same as the this outside of the function. Not true. This could be totally different from this. Okay, so if you do this, you're going to get an error because it's going to tell you socket doesn't have a show function when you execute this code. So how can we solve this problem? There's many ways to do it, but I like to show you the one I usually do, which works very well, which is the next one. Okay, so imagine that we have it something more like this. Okay, we have a function here. It's outside of, I put it outside so it's more cleaner. I call it inner. Okay, this function has a this. This, as I said before, when it executes this on message on the socket, when the socket receives a message, it's going to call this function. But because socket, this function is called through socket, then it's going to assume that this is the socket. Okay, so can we have a way to somehow this over here, okay, this over here can be exactly the same as this one? There's two ways to do that. Okay, the first is the simple one I use all the time, which is this one. Okay, remember about hoisting. The idea of hoisting is that any variable that we define here in this scope can be read from any function that is declared inside this function. So because this function here is declared inside this other function, during the execution of this function, you can access of any local variable that was defined in the upper function. Okay, so let's abuse this, which is very simple. We have a word called this that we can control. Okay, no problem. We create a new variable here in this function. We call it that. I call it that because it's similar to this, so I call it that. This is not a reserved word of JavaScript. It can be, some people call it underscore this, some call it self. I call it that because I think it's very similar to this, so that. Okay, so now this function has a variable called that it has the same value as this. So now inside this function, instead of calling this, if I call it this, will be wrong because it will be the socket, I call that. And because that contains the value was stored here, then this will work. Be careful because if I put this line var that equals this below, I don't know if that will work. Yeah, it probably will work. But anyway, so I usually, many of my functions, when I have a lot of lambda functions, like, or anonymous functions defined inside, I like to put this bar that equal this on the top. So I have this problem fixed. Okay. So now when you call this that.show, it's going to call the that of the same as this, which is in this case, this is my class. Okay. So the trick of the that is also super useful. And this doesn't apply to the DOM. You can use this trick anywhere. Okay. Other solution could have been, I don't know if I put it here on the slides. No. Other solution could have been that because we know here that the socket is going to be the one when I call this function is going to be the same as this. Maybe one hack could be inside the socket. I can add also another variable called .dat, and then I can put this .dat to access this variable. That will be without using hoisting. I can add more elements to this object, and one element could be the pointer to this of here, so I can read it from here. Okay, similar to the trick we did before with the data, but it's better to use the hoisting. This is something you will see in many places. Remember that hoisting only works if the function is defined inside this other function. Okay, if this function was outside, then you won't be able to do the hoisting. Okay, so we have two tricks: injecting data in the object that we know is going to be the this, or using a that and then abusing the hoisting. Okay, both things are very common. You will see these tricks in most JavaScript libraries, so I'm not saying one is better on the other. But there is a better one. This is a more professional one. There's one that most of developers use, which is, can we define a function that retains the same this when you execute this function as the this before this function was executed? And the answer is yes. It's called the arrow operator or the Lambda functions. Here we have declared the function in a different way. Check. Instead of having function as we had prior to define a function, a callback, we usually use this kind of thing. We put on message equals to, and then we put the function that you want to call. Okay, this is a regular anonymous function. But in JavaScript, you can also define what is called a lambda function. Lambda functions are this arrow operator. Okay, so you put first parentheses, the parameters of these functions, close parentheses, then you put the arrow, then you open a key and you put the code of the function. Okay, this is more like a concentrated, very, very small way to define functions, and some people may find it more cool than having to type function all the time. So maybe some people cannot use the arrow operator all the time. Okay, don't confuse the arrow operator with bigger than. Bigger than is the opposite. It will be the bigger than and equal. Okay, bigger than or equal. Sorry. Okay, so when we use the arrow operator, something magic happens is that this function is going to retain the same this as the function where the arrow function was defined. So this is exactly the same as this one. Okay, so you can use this. This is a very common way to do it. If you want it, that's nice. Okay, we are using still defining the function inside. Okay, so this also only makes sense if you're defining this function inside another function, but it's quite easy and the code looks clean, so this will work. Okay, so we have now 3 ways to solve the problem of the this when we are working with callbacks. So let's move to the next one. So in this case, we have an object like a user. It has a name Javi and a function show, and this shows the name. Okay, if we call it, it outputs Javi. This is the example I was showing you before. But if we call this function, okay, outside of the scope, show func, okay, and we call this function, is going to, sorry, it doesn't, okay, one show func, okay, yeah, sorry. This is another interesting thing, okay? If I put here this function show inside this object user, you understand that the this is this object user. But you have to pay attention because this is exactly the same as this one, okay? I define a function, okay, totally outside of anywhere. Okay, this function uses the this, by the way, but it's outside, and then I copy this function as a property of user. If you do this, it works exactly the same because functions don't retain any kind of a scope. Okay, so when you copy this function here, when it's executed, the moment of execution is the moment where the JavaScript will evaluate which is the object that should be the this. Okay, so in this case, because I call this function through this object here, it's going to tell, hey, this function, execute the function here, and as a this, use this object here. Okay, but in many moments we won't have control over this situation. Okay, so this is by the way, you can use this hack if you want to. Imagine that I have a function, show func. If I execute it now, it's going to output undefined because when you execute it without any kind of object, the this points to window. Window doesn't have a property called name. So if you do this, it's going to output undefined. But in JavaScript, if you want to, just an interesting thing to know is that you can say, hey, I want to execute this function, but I want that when you call this function, I want to call it, but I want this object to be the this. So if you do this, when it executes this function, the this is going to be this user because I pass it as a parameter. So every function has this special property, this special method called call, and if you call it, it's going to use this object as the this, okay? In case that you want to do it, but we're not going to do this. We're going to go a little bit more complex and say this, okay? So can I somehow bind together these two things? Can I bind this function with this object? So when this function is called from whatever it is on the code, instead of using whatever object is where it's stored, is going to use this object? And the answer is yes. In JavaScript, you can do this kind of line. If you have a function, you can bind it to an object. If you bind this function with this object, when this it will return a new function. So this function, the function bind, returns a new function, and if you execute this function, even if you don't have any object here, you just execute the function, the this is going to be the object where you bind it. Okay, and this is super useful when you have some object and with some method and you want to pass that method to some callback like an add event listener, for instance. When you're using the DOM, it's very common to say, hey DOM, I want to bind this function with this object, so when you call the event, it's going not to use the element of the HTML after this, but I want to use this specific object. Okay, so as I said, this is very common. For instance, here I can say something like this. If I want to bind this show with this object, in this case the this, I say, hey, take this function, this show, bind it to this object this. So now whatever it returns when this socket calls on message, is going to call it on this object, and because this is this object, my class is going to work perfectly. Okay, so this is the fourth solution. The fourth solution to solving the problem of the this is that you can bind functions with objects. So whenever you have to pass a callback, if you know that the callback is going to use internally this, you better bind it first. Okay. Keep in mind that here I'm not defining a Lambda function or anything like that, although this internal is more or less like similar to a Lambda function, but this is maybe more easy to read. Okay. So recap, there's different ways to solve this problem. We can store data on the object that we know is going to be the this, so we can read it from the anonymous function. We can abuse hoisting and create a that variable on the same scope, so that this is going to assign this to the that variable, so we can read that other variable instead of using the this, because the this is a variable that we cannot control the value. We can use the arrow operator or the bind to have a function that is totally ingrained or binded to this object, and with these solutions you can have the problem of the callbacks solved. I'm very insisting on this because this is a problem you're going to see a lot of times when you program. This is not some kind of random situation that you may find on the future one day. No. This is an error that you're doing already. Okay, this is why on the examples I was showing you before, when I show you the code of my chat, I didn't want to put in any moment this. Look, I didn't put this because if I put this, everything won't work, and then I have to explain other things. So if I want to clean up this code that we have the other day, the best solution should be to do something like this. For instance, put that equal this, for instance, but we a simple way, and say here that on chat. That would be one solution to do it. Or maybe I could have done the other one, which is say, hey, don't use a function, use the arrow one, and in that case I can put this here, and this will have worked perfectly. Or if I wanted even to go smaller, I can have done this. I want to key press, but bind it to the object this. Okay, these four solutions are all exactly the same. They all work exactly the same, and they will solve the problem of using the this. Okay, so here I can use this if I want to, and I can use this. Prior I couldn't do it because if I use this, it won't be wrong. Okay, so now I have cleaned up the code and it looks much more beautiful. I can go back to the example I was showing you before, reload it here. I'm going to remove also these ugly buttons I put before because it doesn't make any sense any longer. So I remove this, go back here, reload, type here, press enter. There's an error. Let me see what's the error. I missed one parenthesis on the table listener. Sorry. Going back to the table listener. Yes, I closed the parenthesis for the bind, but I forgot to close the parenthesis for the table listener. Okay, so back again here, type something, boom, and it works. Okay. So I know can be confusing what I was explaining. It's strange. I know the first time you see all these topics, it could be like, oh, it's a little bit complicated. Okay. When using bind, how do you pass params? That's another interesting question. The theory is that you don't need to pass parameters to the bind function because whoever calls that function is going to be the one who passes the parameters. Okay, so this is not your work. I mean, somebody else is going to call the function, and somebody else is going to pass those parameters. So forget about the parameters. There's a hack that you can also bind parameters to a function, but I don't want to explain that because that's very rare case that you're never going to use. Okay. Cool. So let's keep going. Okay. Why did I say all this? Also, this is a very common error that you're going to do on the next assignment. Previously, I was explaining this during the second assignment, but I want to explain it now in the first assignment because that would save you a lot of time with many errors. But on the second assignment, we're going to have to access databases, and databases are asynchronous. Because they are asynchronous, this is a common error that many of you will do. Okay, so you may want to read a password from a database because you want to read the password from a database. You want a function like get password. Imagine that this get password reads a password that's stored in a database, and you get this password, and then you can use the password, okay? Because otherwise you will have to use callbacks, and you don't like callbacks, I know that, okay? So you will do probably something like this. Oh, okay, I will tell you, if you want to access the database, you have this object called client. Client is a client of the database, so I can access the database. And this database has a method called get. You pass here what you want to fetch from the database, and when the database gets resolved, the fetch to this database gets resolved, it's going to call this function, and it's going to pass you first if there was any error, and if there is no error, it's going to pass you as a second parameter the value of the database. Okay, so as you can see, the access to this database is asynchronous. You ask for something, you have to wait because accessing a database can be very slow. Imagine that the database can be stored in some other machine on the internet. That means it could take seconds to fetch that, and we don't want to block the execution. So whenever you do this, you fetch this variable. This function is asynchronous. But some people might say, yeah, but I don't want to work asynchronous, Javi. I love working synchronous. It makes my code easier. Instead of having to have a lot of functions, can I have something like get password and just read it and keep going? This is the regular synchronous way of programming, the one that you are used to. And because of that, you may want to do something like this, okay? You may want to transform this asynchronous function into a synchronous function, okay? But let's check this code again. So you call this function, you expect to get the pass here, okay? And inside this function, what we do is we have this variable, which is pass is for now it's equal null. I still don't know the password. I'm going to go to the database. I'm going to fetch this password, and when I get the password, I'm going to store it in this variable pass. So when I return, it's going to return the password. But if you're a little bit smart, you will see that this has a big error. This function here is going to be executed later than this function here, okay? Because this is going to be executed when the action of fetching the password is resolved. But that could happen like 3 seconds later. So what is going to happen when you call this function is that you're going to return null. It's going to define pass as null. It's going to call to get the password. Then it's going to execute the next line, which is return null. So return pass, which is null. It's going to return null. And then after a while, pass will transform something else, but this variable is not going to be changed because this variable was returned as a copy, okay? So this doesn't work. And this is one of the first rules of when you work with asynchronous code. You cannot transform asynchronous code in synchronous code. There is not a single way that you can do that. So if you have one single function that is asynchronous on the flow of some action that you want to perform, then all the actions that are around will be also to be asynchronous, because you cannot do just something like this, like regular code, okay? So how we can solve this problem? Okay, so this, as I said, this is a super common action situation that you're going to find. Could be here I'm using a database, could be just a fetch function that you want to fetch something and you want to have a function to fetch something very fast. No, you cannot do it. But you cannot transform any asynchronous code into asynchronous code. Even though in your mind makes sense, you can't, okay? Just keeping that in mind. So imagine that we have this, the function get password. The right way to do will be something like this. When you call get password, okay, you have to pass the callback, and this callback that you're going to pass is going to be when the action is resolved. The hoisting also works for the parameter variable, is going to call this callback function, and it's going to pass the output of this access to the database, okay? So if you want to get the password, you have to use a callback, okay? In this case, get password and do something. And the problem is that if you're making a lot of code, then you cannot keep typing code below this get password to do more actions, because these actions has to be performed when you have the password, okay? So the only solution that you have here is to put the next code inside here. So I get the password, and when I get the password, inside this function, I keep going. Be careful, because now this function is going to have a different scope, and the this won't be the same as the this before. So in these cases, you will have probably to put an arrow function here, or you use the bind, etc. Okay, so suddenly your regular code, which is very easy to read, it starts being more complicated because you have functions that calls more functions that call more functions. Because usually when you have asynchronous code, like accessing the database, you may want to access not one place on the database, you may want to access several places. So you have to put like a chain of actions, okay? So back to asynchronous JavaScript. This is a very common problem when you have asynchronous code, is that you will have to chain all these functions, and when you start chaining functions and chaining functions and chaining functions, you end up with a code that looks like this. Okay, so I want to do this action, which is asynchronous, and when it's resolved, I want to call this other function that has to do something else, which is also asynchronous. That means I have to have another callback, and then you are stacking callbacks and callbacks and callbacks, and you have the we'll call here the pyramid of doom, or some other people call this spaghetti code. Spaghetti because you have like things that jump from place to place, and it's super hard to follow the execution flow. Previously, when we were working on regular synchronous code, we can read from up to down the code, and it was super easy to understand. When you see code like this, for instance, it's very easy to read this code. So this action is performed, then this action, then this action, then this action. And you know that probably every action relies a little bit on the previous actions. So the flow here is very easy. The problem is that we start putting a lot of callbacks, we lose the flow, because this jumps to some function, that jumps to another function, that jumps to another function, that jumps to another function, and it's very hard for your mind to keep in mind what's going on. Okay, so this has been a problem for many years in the programming community on any language that has asynchronous code, and JavaScript is one of the most common cases. So they started thinking, can we solve this problem? So the first thing they come up with is something called the promises. Okay. Promises is a special object of JavaScript. As I said, it's not okay. It's a class, or a special class that you have in JavaScript, and just to show you that you have it in JavaScript, if you go here and you type promise, you see this exists. It's a class, it's an object, and I can create a class very easily here. Say because new promise. Okay. Well, yes, it's expecting here some parameters I didn't send, and this is why it's complaining. But it's a class that comes now with all the browsers. Previously, by the way, this class didn't come with all the browsers. It was introduced by developers that needed to use, like, have the code less spaghetti. So they decided to use this class. The idea is that when you have several callbacks, you can chain them in something that looks like this. Okay, imagine that this function, when it's resolved, is going to going to call a callback. Then you can, using promises, you can do something that looks like this. I'm going to show you how this works, but for now, let's check what the people expected to have. So they wanted to call, for instance, the function fetch. Function fetch, it's the one to do an HTTP request. It's asynchronous, but they decided to say, hey, why don't we, when this action is resolved, we put .then, and then we put another function. And when this is resolved, .then, and we put another function, .catch is in case of any of these functions there was an error, call this function to know the error. Okay, so this is a beauty. When you read this, it's more beautiful to read because it's more linear. You can know that this action goes first, and then goes this action, then this action, and if any of these actions has an error, it's going to call this action here. This parse data, attached to DOM, or show error are functions, are callbacks. Okay. So this is more or less the basic idea, that we have a way to control the flow of the execution. Cool. So this is what they wanted to do. So what they did was created this promise class, and when you have a function that is going to use a callback, you can return a promise attached to that callback. I will show you how to do that. So they can put the .then. So this function fetch returns a promise. Okay, let's go a little bit in deeper. So a promise is a class that can attach many callbacks. Okay, when you create a promise, you can attach several callbacks to that promise, and once the first action is resolved, it's going to execute the next action on the line. Okay, I know it sounds kind of strange. I'm not expecting that you understand promises now. It will take you several months to understand promises, and some people have been coding JavaScript for years and they still struggle with promises. Once you understand it, it's nice because it makes your code, your asynchronous code, much easier. Okay, so I don't want to explain now that the method then and the catch and the finally. If you want to know more about promises, I recommend you to check this promises class API, which is that explains everything about the promises. But the nice thing, I'm going to show you an example here. Like if I have these three functions and they could be asynchronous, if I want to fetch some data and then call, I have fetch data. Remember that the fetch data returns an object of the type promise, and this object contains a method called then. The method then expects a callback. So I call this function, if this function process data doesn't return any callback, when I return, it's going to call the next one automatically. But if this function returns a callback, then it's going to wait until that callback, not callback, promise. If a function doesn't return any promise, whatever it returns, like a number, whatever, is going to call the next function on the line with passing the output of the previous function. But if this function returned a promise, then it's going to wait, and when that promise is resolved, it's going to call the next function on the line. So it's a way to change function that could be synchronous, like this function, for instance, show data is synchronous, but could also be asynchronous. I don't have an example here, but you can have it, okay? So how can you construct a promise attached to some callback, some event? Just to see the syntax. The syntax is something, well, anyway, here I am explaining some examples of how to use the method then, okay? Once one step is completed, it goes to the next one. But what I want to show you is that, for instance, if you have several promises, like fetch returns one promise, and this other fetch to another file returns another promise, and this returns another promise. So we are waiting to these three promises to be fulfilled. You can put them together in an array and say, call this function when all the promises here are solved. Okay, so then you don't have to chain with like call one function and the other manually. You can just say wait till the three of them are solved, and then you call this one. And I think this one is going to receive all the data from all the three at the same time. I don't remember the structure, but something like that. Okay, how can you construct a promise? And this is where it gets a little bit tricky if you're not used to. You don't have to construct promises, by the way, because promises come automatically with all the libraries you are going to use usually. So there is no need for you to know how to use promises, how to construct promises. But it's important you know how to use promises because you're going to use them, okay? So in this case, we have this promise and we have this function setTimeout. Remember what does setTimeout does. setTimeout is a function that you pass another function and it's going to call it after some milliseconds, okay? But we want to make it more beautiful. We want to make something like wait, for instance, 1000 seconds, and then call another function like my func, okay? Can we transform the setTimeout, which is asynchronous but doesn't use promises, to something that looks more like a promise? Yes. How you do that? First, I create a function wait, because I expect the people who use this wait function to receive a promise, so they can put the dot then. I need that this function returns a promise. So my function wait is going to return a new promise. But how we make that this problem is going to be resolved once this action is done, in this case when the setTimeout is completed. When you construct a promise, you have to pass a function as the first parameter of this new class, and the function is going to be called instantly when you define these new promises. Is going to call this function and it's going to pass two parameters. The first parameter is going to be a callback, call it resolve, and the second is going to be a callback, call it fail. So when you call this callback here, this resolve, whenever you call this one, it's going to execute the next thing on the line of the promise. And if you call this callback here, so remember, these are not, these are variables, but inside they are, this is a function, you can call it. Okay, and if you call this one fail, it's going to execute the one on the catch, the one where there is an error on the promise. Okay, so for now, what we want is that when the time comes, I resolve this callback. Okay, this promise. So I say setTimeout, execute this function resolve after some milliseconds. So what's going to happen is it's going to construct this promise, attach it to this function. Okay, so when this and it's because it has called, the setTimeout will start after 1000 milliseconds. Here is going to call this resolve. Because it calls resolve, the promise will be resolved, and then it's going to go to the next function. Okay, as I said, you don't need to build promises. This is an example of how you can create your own promise if you want to do. In which case you may want to construct promises is usually when you want to transform a callback function like this setTimeout, you want to transform it into a promise, a more like chained thing. In that case, you need to construct probably the promises. But if you want to just use promises from other libraries, it's okay. You don't need to do these kind of things. But there is a good thing if you know how to construct promises, and that's the tricky thing, which is the next. So here, for instance, I have all this code here. well, anyway, I didn't put example. Yeah. So why do we want to create promises? As I said, this is not easy. It takes time, but there's one case that if you learn how to use promises well, and as I said, this is the case of the first picture I showed you the other day. With there was some guys pushing a cart with square wheels, and somebody showed them the wheel is round, and they say we don't have time. If you learn how to use promises well, you will work super fast without problems. Why? Because there's something else that come after the promises that when the promises were already working, which were what is called asynchronous functions. The idea is that you can have a function that can be stopped until some promise is resolved, and when the promise is resolved, it can continue executing the function. So you can do something like this. Check this function. Okay, this function has to fetch some data, but here you see I'm not using the dot then. I'm not using a callback. I'm just calling this function and saying wait. And then when this is resolved, it's going to pass the data here, and I can continue executing the code. So this is amazing. It means that now I can use asynchronous code as if it was synchronous code. It's not synchronous code because when you call this function, you have to specify this is a asynchronous function. So if you call this function, it's not going to block the code. It's going to execute until it finds the first asynchronous code. When it finds the await, it's going to return the function. It's going to exit the function. But the nice thing is when this promise is resolved, it's going to continue executing from here. Okay. So if you know how to use promises well, you may end up constructing asynchronous functions. And asynchronous functions make your code super, super easy to read. Like here, I await for this promise to be resolved. When it's resolved, I get the data, and then I parse it, I do some stuff, okay? So this is the holy grail. Once you master promises, you have the asynchronous functions, and then your code gets super simple to read. But first, you have to struggle with the asynchronous functions, okay? Here's an example of this. Okay, so suddenly this ugly function we have at the beginning, this get password, can be transformed in an asynchronous function. Look, I can do something like this. Pass equals to await get password. And what it's going to do is it's going to call get password, and this get password is going to return a promise, and this promise is going to be resolved once I get the data from the database. So when it returns this promise, it's going to wait here, and when the database answers, it's going to continue executing the code. So suddenly, you have transformed a code that looks asynchronous in something that looks synchronous, but it's not. It's still asynchronous, but it looks like it's synchronous. So it's easy to read, okay? So that's why I wanted to explain this, all this part of the class here in a video streaming, because I want you to read the slides as many times as you have to, and hear me explaining the slides as many times as you need to, because if you master the asynchronous and you master the this and the bind and all the callbacks, coding in JavaScript is super easy. The problem is if you don't, you're going to make mistakes and you won't understand what's going on. And that's the main problem where people lose a lot of time, okay? So here are more explanations. I would recommend you that you do this interactive course. It's a very super fun interactive course where it makes you questions that you have to type the resolution of the code here, and then it goes to the next question, and you have to type code here. So you start with very simple, like typing like an operation, mathematical operation here, and you end up coding functions asynchronously. So that's super cool, and at the end you will have better knowledge about how to use asynchronous code or concurrency, how it's usually called. Okay. So that's it mostly. Because I have 3 minutes, maybe it will be nice. Well, I mean, remember that you have to send me the assignment next Monday at 23, 11 o'clock at night. So that means that we won't have many chances to talk again. So my idea, remember, and let's go to the slides of the course in case that you don't have them here. So 1 second, let me open the slides of the first assignment, that you have them on the Aula Global, which is this one over here. Okay. So again, check out the requirements spec. this here, I want that the chat works. And to make the chat work, you're going to need to use the silly client library. Remember how to use this library in case that you have forgot, because it could be important. Let me go to the code I have here. So we are going to need to have a silly client. To have the silly client, first we need to include the library. Okay, the library silly client.js in the slides is a place where you can download it. Okay, silly client.js. So now I have this silly client.js. If I go to my code, I can instantiate here whatever I want to. Maybe the best place would be on the init. I can say, I don't know, silly client equals new silly client. Okay, so now I can, sorry, I'm going to store it in the this because maybe I want to find it. Okay, and if I go again to the silly client thingy of how to instantiate and everything, let me go to what it is. Yeah, here. Okay, I need to connect to the server. Let's call it server, maybe it looks better. So I'm going to try to connect to the server. Connect, and here I have to specify the address of the server. Okay, for the address of the server, I think I have it here. Yeah, this is the address of the server. I'm going to put it, and also remember that you have to specify which room do you want to join. Okay, so let's go here, and I'm going to join this room. Okay, so now if everything goes well, I will be connected after a while. It will take some time. It won't be instant because connecting to remote takes some time. Okay, once I'm connected, okay, the next thing I want to is to know what's my, it was like this already, probably, I don't remember now, already, yeah. So I want to know my ID. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this function. But here we have the problem we talked about before. If I use the this inside here, it's not going to work. So this is the first error. Okay, we can do it. We can apply what we learned today. First, maybe you want to call on server ready. Okay, a function that is inside this class on my chat. But remember always to bind it to this object, because now it's binded to this object. That means that if I call this function, the this will be the correct one. So let's put it here, this function. And this function, I'm going to get the user ID. If everything goes well, I get the user ID. Let's show the user ID. Maybe I can do show message. Your user, like something like connected. Your user ID is user ID. So let's check to see that this works. Okay, so I open this. Connected. Your user ID is 1397. Cool. So I'm connected. If I reload again, you will see that it gives me a new ID and a new ID. Every time I connect, I disconnect the previous one, but the ID always gets incremented. Cool. So now I'm connected to the server. The next thing I need is that if somebody connects to this one, I want to be notified on connect, on user connected. I want to call a function like, I don't know, on this on server user connected, and I want to bind it to the same object. So I'm going to put this function here, and it's going to tell me the user ID of the person who is connected. So maybe I can do this again, but instead of showing connected, it can show somebody connected. Somebody connected, and I can know the ID of this person. Cool. Now, if everything goes well, I can test it. I'm connected, but I can open this tab again. And if I open the tab again, I can see that here it says somebody connected. And here it tells that I was the 1400 or 1413. And here it's telling, hey, somebody connected the 1413. Cool. 2 steps done. First step, I want to know is somebody disconnected. So I go here and say if user disconnected, I want to call the function on user disconnected. So I'm going to go here, clone this function maybe, and have here something like on user disconnected. Somebody left the room, and somebody joined the room. Cool. So now I can go back here, reload, I'm connected, and if I reload here, says somebody left the room and somebody joined the room. Well, it says because when I reload, I left the room and joined again the room. Okay, if I here left the room, it says always that every time I reload here, I'm leaving the room and joining the room again because I'm refreshing. Okay, I can see it here. And finally, what I want is that when I type here, other person can see what I'm typing. And let's put this side to side, that would be more beautiful. Okay, so the last step could be something as simple as saying, and the final. If I get a message on message from somebody, I want to say server user message, for instance. Okay, so now when somebody connects on server user message, I'm going to get who wrote the message and also what's the message. And then here I can type something like, I don't know, user ID, the user has said, and then the message. Okay, cool. I can do this, and now the problem would be that to receive a message on server use message, I need that somebody sends the message. And currently, when I type here on this place and press enter, I'm just showing the message, but I'm not using that message for anything. Okay, so the last thing should be to send the message. So I'm going to go to the server, which is here, this server, and every time you type something, I'm going to send the message. And in this case, the message is going to be, sorry, I'm going to put it before I clear it out, because otherwise it will be empty input value. And tachan, if everything goes well, let's test it now. I reload here, and if I type here hello, 1424 has said hello, and it can say how are you, and 1423 has said how are you. Okay, so now we have the most simple chat. Okay, remember these are two different windows, and this may work also if you were in another computer and connected through the internet and to the other one. So now I can chat, the chat works. Okay, obviously one of the errors I'm doing here, I'm not using the protocol. Okay, I'm sending the messages as they are, like regular text messages. Okay, and it will be way better if we use it something more like object that we can use that contains the text, the protocol that we define it. So that it's up to you. Remember, you can use objects here. I can use an object here, for instance. MSG, when I send a message, is going to be this object. But if I do this, I send this object. Keep in mind that if I reload this and I reload the other one and I type something here, I'm receiving the object itself. No, and maybe I need to transform this in an object. Not this, sorry, I'm receiving the string of the object. So always remember, when you receive the message, in this case on user message, this here, maybe you want to transform it in an object, like I don't know, which equal hot JSON parse, and then you pass the message. So now you transform this string into an object, and then from here you can read object point and the parameter you want. In this case, I send MSG, maybe text, maybe better. No, content. I say it was content. So I can say object content. Okay. If I do this, now when I send, I create in an object that contains a content parameter, which is the text. And when you receive it here, it will receive a string, transform the string back to the object, and now I can show the parameter I want to. This opens the possibility to add a lot of properties here, username, time, whatever, and we will make everything much simpler. Okay, so I think that's all for today. You have 4 days, 5 days to Monday. I expect you to make a nice chat with all the features. If you want to do several rooms, to people to be able to talk in different rooms, you will need to have a lot of instances of the server, and having a lot of instances of the server could be a little bit annoying, so be careful with that. But for private messages, remember that the function send message, you can specify at the end of this function another parameter with the ID of the person where you want to send the message. Okay, so I leave you here. I hope that you managed to do something nice with everything I explained today, and see you next Monday, where you will have a little bit of time to show me what you have done and fix the latest bugs. Okay, cool. See you on Monday. Bye bye.